When my parents passed away, my brother celebrated inheriting everything. The historic Atlanta estate, the money, the megachurch they built from the ground up, all of it went to him. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to leave the property immediately. But then the lawyer asked him a simple question about the will, a question that made my brother's confidence vanish. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who completely underestimated your worth. I am Harper, 32 years old, and for my entire life, I was the designated cleanup crew for my family. Growing up in Atlanta, my parents, Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne, were practically royalty in the religious community. They led a massive congregation projecting an image of absolute perfection, immense faith, and generational wealth. But behind the stained glass windows and the designer suits, our family dynamic was deeply toxic. My older brother Julian was the undisputed golden child. At 35, he was being groomed to take over the pulpit. He had the charisma, the booming voice, and the handsome features that made the congregation adore him. I, on the other hand, was the analytical, quiet daughter who chose numbers over sermons. I became a forensic accountant, a career my parents viewed as unglamorous and entirely unhelpful to their public image. The tension reached its breaking point on a rainy Tuesday morning inside Attorney Vaughn's mahogany-paneled office. We were there for the reading of my parents' will. The air in the room felt heavy, smelling of expensive leather and old paper. Attorney Vaughn, a man in his late 60s who had handled our family's legal affairs for decades, sat behind his massive desk, looking utterly exhausted. Across from me sat Julian, wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car. Next to him was his wife, Brittany. Brittany was 33, a white lifestyle influencer who had built a massive social media following by portraying herself as the perfect blessed pastor's wife. She sat there meticulously filing her nails, looking bored by the legal proceedings. Attorney Vaughn cleared his throat and began reading the final stipulations of the estate. The division of assets was exactly as I had expected, yet hearing it spoken aloud still carried a sharp sting. Julian was awarded the historic family estate in the prestigious Buckhead neighborhood, valued at roughly $2.5 million. He was formally granted full leadership of the megachurch, its associated charity funds, and every single liquid asset my parents had to their names. And then came my portion. Attorney Vaughn handed me a thin manila folder. To Harper, he read the deceased leave the entirety of a limited liability company known as Breyer Holdings. I opened the folder. Inside was the deed to a bankrupt, forgotten LLC. The assets consisted of a trash-filled vacant lot in a deeply neglected part of the city and a boarded-up laundromat with a collapsed roof. That was it. 32 years of being the dutiful daughter, reduced to a literal garbage dump. Julian leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together with a smug, self-satisfied smile. "Mom and Dad knew you always liked cleaning up my messes since high school, Harper," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You were always so good at sorting through the dirt. So just consider this your final assignment. Enjoy the literal garbage dump, Ms. Forensic Accountant." Brittany did not even bother looking up from her manicure. "Actually, Harper, since we are handling business today, I need you out of the estate's guest house by Friday," she announced casually. "Julian needs that space. We are turning it into a showroom for his custom sneaker collection. The contractor is coming on Monday, so you need to be completely gone before the weekend." I stared at her, absorbing the sheer audacity of her demand. The guest house she was referring to had been my home for the last 5 years. But I had not been living there to leech off my parents. I had moved into that cramped space to be a full-time caregiver when both my mother and father fell severely ill. While Julian was traveling the country preaching at conferences and Brittany was posting sponsored content from luxury resorts, I was the one making sure our parents took their medication. I was the one managing their doctors. And more importantly, I was the one paying for the upkeep of that very estate out of my own pocket because their finances were mysteriously tied up. "You want me out by Friday so you can build a sneaker closet?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Brittany sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as if I were being entirely unreasonable. Do not play the victim, Harper. It is not a good look on you. You have been living rent-free on Julian's property long enough. Honestly, you should be thanking us. At least you have a place to sleep right now instead of just feeding off the wealth my husband inherited. It is time for you to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Brittany, a woman who had never worked a traditional job in her life, sitting there in a diamond tennis bracelet paid for by my family's church, lecturing me about independence. She weaponized her fragile, soft-spoken tone to deliver the most venomous insults, a tactic she used perfectly to make me look like the angry, aggressive black woman if I ever dared to raise my voice in response. Julian chuckled, placing a comforting hand on Brittany's knee. Let her be, babe. You know she is just bitter. She always resented the calling God placed on my life. I did not scream. I did not cry. Years of investigating corporate fraud had taught me that emotion was a liability in the face of greed. Data, on the other hand, was absolute. Data did not care about your feelings, your status, or your social media followers. I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up my banking application. You are absolutely right, Julian, I said smoothly, not breaking eye contact. I should be completely independent. And you, as the new head of the family and the sole heir to the liquid assets, should also embrace your total financial independence. I pressed a button on the screen. The satisfying confirmation chime echoed loudly in the quiet office. What was that? Julian asked, his smug smile faltering just a fraction. That was me disabling the platinum credit card you have been carrying in your wallet for the last 3 years, I replied, setting the tablet down on the mahogany desk. I also just canceled the automatic bank transfer that pays the $4,000 monthly maintenance and lease fee for your Porsche. Julian shot up from his chair, his face twisting in sudden panic. You did what? You cannot do. That I have a pastoral networking dinner tonight. I leaned forward, mirroring his earlier relaxed posture. You inherited the millions, Pastor Julian. You inherited the grand estate. But you seem to have forgotten that for the past 3 years, my salary as a senior forensic accountant has been quietly funding your luxury lifestyle because Mom and Dad refused to let the church board see how recklessly you spend money. I kept you afloat to protect their image. But since I am cut off, and since I need to find a new place to live by Friday, I will no longer be subsidizing your ego. Enjoy the estate, Julian. From now on, you pay for your own tires. Brittany dropped her nail file, her mouth falling open. You are cutting off our car. Harper, how are we supposed to get to the gala on Saturday? You are being incredibly petty and vindictive over a guest house. I am being financially responsible, Brittany. I shot back, silencing her immediately. Something you might want to look into before you start tearing down walls for a sneaker showroom. The room descended into a chaotic shouting match, with Julian demanding I reactivate the card and Brittany whining about how I was intentionally trying to ruin their public image. I simply sat there, feeling a profound sense of liberation wash over me. For my entire life, I had been taught to shrink myself to make room for Julian's greatness. I was conditioned to believe that my role was to support him, to clean up after him, to endure the microaggressions and the blatant disrespect, because that was what a strong, supportive sister was supposed to do. But seeing the absolute terror in his eyes over a canceled credit card proved what I had always known deep down. Julian was not a king. He was a parasite. And I had just cut off his primary food supply. Attorney Vaughn, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of weariness and quiet respect, finally cleared his throat loudly. He tapped his pen against the thick stack of legal documents on his desk, demanding order. If we could please return to the matter at hand, Attorney Vaughn said, his deep voice cutting through Julian's rant. There is a final piece of paperwork that needs to be acknowledged. He pushed a document toward my brother. Julian snatched it up, still fuming, his chest heaving with indignation. What is this? Julian snapped. Just give me the keys to the house so we can leave. I have to call my bank now because my sister decided to have a hysterical breakdown. Attorney Vaughn did not flinch at the disrespect. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at my brother with a gaze that held decades of hidden family secrets. Julian, he began carefully. Did you actually read the liability clause attached to the estate you just eagerly claimed? Julian waved his hand dismissively, barely glancing at the paper. Liability clause. It is a house, Vaughn. A fully paid-off historic mansion. Mom and Dad owned it free and clear. I am the sole owner now. There is nothing to read. Just file the paperwork and transfer the deeds. Are you absolutely certain you understand the terms of the will? Julian the lawyer pressed his tone, carrying a subtle grave warning that completely went over my brother's head. I said I understand it, Julian barked, signing his name furiously at the bottom of the page. Do your job and file it. Come on, Brittany, we are leaving. As Julian and Brittany stormed out of the office, slamming the heavy wooden door behind them, Attorney Vaughn released a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me, a silent communication passing between us. He knew exactly the kind of man my brother was, and he knew exactly what my parents had done. I did not ask him about the liability clause. I knew it was not my place, and as a forensic accountant, I preferred to find the truth hidden in the numbers myself. My mind raced back to the days when my parents were still alive. Bishop Ezekiel was a man whose voice could shake the very foundations of the sanctuary. He preached about charity, humility, and family unity. Yet behind closed doors, he was a man obsessed with appearances. He bought tailored suits while the church roof leaked. Corinne, my mother, was his perfect counterpart. She wore custom hats and pearls, smiling for the cameras, while quietly managing the social hierarchy of the congregation with an iron fist. They had structured our entire family around Julian. From the time we were children, every resource was funneled into his success. When Julian crashed his first car driving recklessly, my parents took the money saved for my college tuition to cover his legal fees and buy him a new vehicle. You have to understand, Harper, my mother had said, adjusting her pearls. Your brother carries the future of this ministry. We cannot allow his reputation to be tarnished. You are strong. You will figure out your own path. I was always the strong one, the one expected to endure, the one who did not need help or comfort or financial support, because I was capable of surviving the struggle. They weaponized my resilience to justify their neglect. I opened the thin manila folder containing the details of my meager inheritance. Briar Holdings, a trash-filled lot, a ruined laundromat. I flipped to the second page of the property deed. My eyes scanned the tedious legal jargon, the property dimensions, the county tax assessments. It all looked like a dead end, exactly as Julian had mocked. But then I saw it. In the bottom right corner of the final page, buried under a list of old municipal utility easements, was a 12-digit alphanumeric code. Most people would have completely ignored it, assuming it was just bureaucratic filing trivia. But I was not most people. I spent my days analyzing commercial real estate acquisitions, zoning laws, and corporate asset transfers. I recognized the format of that specific code immediately. It was a highly classified restricted city zoning designation, a designation that was only ever applied to plots of land that had been secretly approved for massive high-level commercial development. I traced the numbers with my index finger, my heart suddenly beating faster against my ribs. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Julian thought he had left me with the family garbage. He thought he had discarded me with a worthless piece of dirt. Sitting in Attorney Vaughn's office looking at the 12-digit zoning code on the Briar Holdings deed, I realized that their ultimate act of neglect was about to become my greatest weapon. The code indicated a Tier 1 commercial rezoning. In Atlanta, this kind of quiet back-channel rezoning only happened when massive tech conglomerates were quietly buying up blocks of undesirable land through proxy buyers to build something monumental without alerting the public and driving up local real estate prices. They thought they gave me a useless lot in a forgotten neighborhood. But the city had already quietly approved this exact grid for something massive. I closed the manila folder and tucked it safely into my leather briefcase. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. Attorney Vaughn watched me, a faint glimmer of a smile hiding behind his stoic professional demeanor. "Will you be all right, Harper?" he asked quietly. "Finding a new place to live by Friday is no small task." I looked at the closed door where my brother and his wife had just exited. I thought about the canceled credit cards, the upcoming maintenance bills for the Porsche, and the mysterious liability clause Julian had arrogantly ignored. "I will be perfectly fine, Mr. Vaughn," I replied, my voice steady and resonant with a newfound power. "In fact, I think Friday is going to be the start of a very beautiful weekend." I walked out of the law firm and stepped into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The humid air felt different today. It felt like freedom. Julian had told me to enjoy the garbage. He had told me to stand on my own 2 feet. I pulled out my phone and dialed a contact at the city planning office, a former client whose books I had audited and saved from a massive tax penalty years ago. It was time to find out exactly what Briar Holdings was truly worth and exactly how hard my brother was about to fall. 3 days passed since the reading of the will. 3 long days of absolute silence from Julian and Brittany. I spent those days moving my entire life out of the estate guest house and into a modest, practical apartment downtown. I did not shed a single tear while packing my boxes. I just packed. I packed my professional clothes. I packed my forensic accounting textbooks. I packed away 32 years of being the dutiful daughter. I packed away the painful memories of being overlooked and undervalued. I knew the storm was coming because Julian could never survive his own reality. My parents had built a towering, fragile illusion of wealth, and Julian was entirely dependent on that illusion. But numbers do not lie. Numbers always reveal the honest truth. On the morning of the 4th day, the truth finally caught up with him. Julian discovered that the historic Buckhead estate did not come free and clear as he had so arrogantly assumed in the lawyer's office. My parents had taken out a massive hidden third mortgage on the property. The debt was staggering, $1.8 million. And they did not use that borrowed money for church repairs or charitable community funds. They used it to fund Julian's extravagant pastoral inauguration campaign. They bought his custom Italian suits. They bought the private catered dinners for wealthy church elders. They bought his expensive marketing team. They bought his entire holy image with borrowed money. Now the bank wanted their money back. The monthly payments on a $1.8 million commercial scale loan were astronomical. Julian was financially drowning. I knew he was drowning because my former contacts at the local bank told me he had frantically tried to take out another line of credit and was instantly denied. But instead of accepting reality and downgrading his lifestyle, Julian did what he always did. He looked for someone else to pay the bill. He looked for me. He refused to sell his luxury cars. He refused to cancel his upcoming luxury vacation to Dubai. He refused to wear anything less than designer brands. He needed cash immediately, and he needed me back under his thumb to manage his crumbling empire. He needed my paycheck. He needed my excellent credit score. He needed my blind obedience. I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm reviewing a complex corporate tax file when my office phone rang. It was the managing partner of our firm calling me into his office immediately. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, I saw my boss sitting behind his large desk, looking deeply uncomfortable and unusually pale. He told me to close the door. He told me to sit down. He told me that he had just received a highly disturbing phone call from a very respected local figure, Pastor Julian. My own brother had used his religious title and his public platform to call my employer and launch a vicious, calculated attack against my character. Julian told my boss that he had caught me embezzling funds from our late parents' megachurch. He claimed I was a thief. He claimed I was mentally unstable since their passing. He claimed I was secretly battling severe addiction issues. He strongly suggested that the firm should terminate my employment immediately to avoid a massive public scandal that could ruin the accounting firm's professional reputation. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to completely destroy my career. He wanted to completely destroy my reputation. He wanted to completely destroy my future. He wanted to strip away my financial independence so I would have no choice but to come crawling back to him. He wanted me desperate enough to accept a low-paying job as his personal assistant, just so he could force me to figure out how to save his mansion from foreclosure. The betrayal cut deep. It cut through bone. It cut through years of my silent, unrewarded loyalty. I had protected his secrets for years. I had protected his public image. I had protected his fragile pride. And this was his gratitude. My boss looked at me with deep pity and slid a formal termination agreement across the sleek wooden desk. He said the firm could not risk the negative publicity of having an accused embezzler on the payroll, especially with a prominent and beloved megachurch pastor making the serious accusations. I looked at the printed termination paper. I looked at the silver pen resting right beside it. Then I looked at my boss. I did not cry. I did not beg for my job. I did not try to passionately defend my character against my brother's obvious lies. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily bound folder. 300 pages of meticulous, undeniable forensic auditing. I slid the heavy document across the mahogany desk, placing it directly over the termination papers. My boss frowned and asked what it was. I told him it was the absolute truth. For the past 8 months, I had been quietly tracking the financial records of the firm's largest and most lucrative corporate client, a massive commercial real estate developer who brought in millions of dollars in billing for our firm every single year. I explained that I had traced every single transaction, every offshore bank account, every hidden shell company, every inflated operating expense. I tracked it all. I tracked the missing millions. I tracked the illegal kickbacks to city officials. I tracked the fraudulent tax returns that our firm had been blindly rubber stamping for nearly a decade. I tracked the false charity donations used to hide vast amounts of corporate wealth. I told my boss that our biggest client was committing federal tax fraud on a monumental scale and that our accounting firm was legally exposed for facilitating and ignoring it. My boss turned completely pale as he frantically flipped through the pages of my report. The numbers were irrefutable. I told him that I had already prepared a complete certified report for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I told him that I would be walking out of this office today and delivering that report directly to the federal authorities unless 2 specific things happened immediately. First, the firm would formally drop Julian as a client and sever all financial ties with his church by the end of the business day. Second, I would not be terminated. Instead, I would be promoted to senior partner effective, right this second, with full profit-sharing benefits. The silence in the room was absolute and heavy. My boss looked at the evidence of his own gross negligence, and then he looked at me. He saw the cold determination in my eyes. He saw that I was not bluffing in the slightest. He slowly picked up the termination agreement and tore it into pieces, dropping them into his wastebasket. He offered his trembling hand across the desk. I walked out of that office not as an unemployed victim, but as a senior partner with the power to ruin anyone who stood in my way. That same evening, Julian was hosting his lavish church inauguration dinner at the most exclusive banquet hall in the heart of Atlanta. The massive room was filled with wealthy congregants, local politicians, and elite socialites who had paid thousands of dollars just to attend. Giant crystal chandeliers sparkled brightly above round tables draped in expensive white silk. Julian stood at the front of the room, holding a microphone, wearing a custom velvet tuxedo jacket, and soaking in the blind adoration of his followers. Brittany stood faithfully beside him, wearing a sparkling designer gown, playing the role of the humble, devoted pastor's wife. They were selling a perfect, flawless illusion of divine favor and endless wealth. I decided it was time to shatter that illusion completely. I walked through the tall double doors of the banquet hall wearing a sharp crimson business suit. I did not wait for an invitation from the ushers. I walked straight down the center aisle, my heels clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. Heads turned rapidly as I passed. Hushed whispers broke out among the congregation as people recognized the sister who had supposedly gone crazy. Julian saw me approaching and his arrogant smile instantly froze. He gripped the microphone tightly, clearly panicking because he assumed I was at home crying over losing my corporate job. He assumed I was broken. He assumed I was defeated. He assumed completely wrong. I walked right up to the elevated stage. Julian tried to recover his composure and offered a tight, fake smile to the confused crowd. He leaned down and whispered harshly, asking what I was doing there and telling me I was ruining his holy night. He told me I was an embarrassment. He told me to leave before he had security drag me out. I did not lower my voice. I did not play his cowardly game of whispers and shadows. I pulled a thick legal envelope from my jacket pocket and slapped it onto the wooden podium right in front of his microphone. The loud sound echoed through the entire silent hall. I looked at Julian and smiled a cold, predatory smile. That is the official bank foreclosure notice on the Buckhead estate, Julian. I spoke clearly and loudly into the microphone, so every single wealthy donor and politician in the room could hear me. The bank is calling in the $1.8 million commercial mortgage Mom and Dad secretly took out just to pay for this very party. You have exactly 48 hours to pay them in full, or they are changing the locks and throwing you out on the street. God bless you, Pastor Julian. The luxurious banquet hall erupted into absolute chaos. Loud gasps echoed from every single table. Wealthy donors started whispering frantically to each other, pointing fingers at the stage. Brittany dropped her expensive champagne glass, and it shattered loudly on the marble floor. She lunged forward, grabbing Julian aggressively by the arm and demanding to know what I was talking about. Julian stood entirely frozen, staring at the foreclosure notice, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and terrified. His perfect, pristine image had just been violently ripped apart in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress. I did not stay to watch him try to explain away his massive hidden debt. I turned around and walked back down the long aisle with my head held high, leaving the burning wreckage of his reputation behind me. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. The night felt electric and alive. I had finally stopped cleaning up his messes and started holding him accountable for them. As I reached my car in the parking lot, my cell phone began to ring. It was an unknown number from California. I answered it, fully expecting it to be a confused church elder, or perhaps Brittany calling to scream at me in a panic. Instead, a crisp, highly professional voice spoke on the other end of the line. "Miss Harper," the voice asked respectfully. I confirmed my identity. The caller introduced himself as the head of land acquisitions for a top-tier Silicon Valley technology conglomerate. "We have been trying to track you down for days," the man said, his tone urgent. "We verified the county property deeds this morning and confirmed that you are the sole legal owner of Briar Holdings." I stood perfectly still, leaning against my car door. "Yes, I legally own Briar Holdings," I replied. The executive took a deep breath and delivered the words that would change the trajectory of my entire life forever. "Miss Harper, your vacant lot under Briar Holdings is the exact epicenter of our planned regional data center. It is the only piece of land we need to complete the grid. We are prepared to offer you $36 million for the deed, and we need to buy it immediately. We have the contracts ready. We have the legal team standing by. We just need your signature to transfer the $36 million into your account." I ended the call with the tech executive thanking him for his time and stating I would have my legal counsel review the purchase agreements before moving forward. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet interior of my car, letting the sheer magnitude of the number wash over me. $36 million. It was not just wealth, it was absolute unshakable power. But I knew Julian and Brittany perfectly. I knew the moment the city zoning board officially ratified the development permits, the public property records would update, and my brother would inevitably find out what he had surrendered. I had to move quickly and quietly, but as it turned out, the truth always finds a way to travel faster than any legal paperwork ever could. Brittany practically lived at the elite country clubs around the affluent Buckhead neighborhood, mingling effortlessly with the wives of local politicians, city developers, and corporate executives. She used these social gatherings to maintain her carefully curated image as the flawless, charitable wife of Atlanta's most prominent young pastor. 2 days after my explosive confrontation at the banquet hall, she was having lunch on a shaded terrace overlooking a pristine golf course. She was sipping sparkling water and pretending everything was perfectly fine with the church finances despite the massive foreclosure notice looming over their heads. As fate would have it, she happened to be seated directly behind a senior city planning commissioner and a prominent commercial real estate developer. She eavesdropped as they spoke in low, excited voices about the massive Silicon Valley acquisition that was about to completely transform the downtown grid. The developer mentioned that the entire regional data center project had been hopelessly stalled for months over one incredibly stubborn piece of land, but the tech firm had finally located the new owner. He specifically named Breyer Holdings. He specifically mentioned the unprecedented $36 million buyout offer. I can only imagine the absolute terror and the violent draining of color from Brittany's face as she sat frozen in her expensive patio chair. She realized in that exact moment that the literal garbage dump they had so viciously mocked me for inheriting was actually worth more than the entire megachurch and Julian's historic estate combined. She did not even stay to finish her gourmet meal. She abandoned her table and practically sprinted to her luxury vehicle to call Julian in a state of absolute hysteria. They must have panicked, realizing their catastrophic mistake. They needed to get the deed back into their possession before they assumed I found out its true astronomical value. The very next morning, there was a frantic, desperate knock on the door of my new apartment. I opened it to find Brittany standing in the hallway, putting on the performance of an absolute lifetime. Her usually flawless professional makeup was intentionally smudged around her eyes. She was wearing a simple, oversized knit sweater instead of her usual tailored designer labels. Her eyes were red, puffy, and brimming with heavy, unshed tears. She looked exactly like a woman on the verge of a total psychological breakdown. She asked if she could please come inside, her voice trembling with a highly manufactured fragility that was designed to disarm me. I stepped aside silently and let her into my modest living room, watching her every movement with the cold, detached observation of a forensic auditor. She sat cautiously on the edge of my sofa and immediately launched into her meticulously rehearsed act. She told me that Julian was drowning in an ocean of unbearable stress. She cried openly about the foreclosure notice I had delivered, saying the financial pressure was destroying their marriage and threatening to tear the entire church congregation apart. She clasped her trembling hands together and looked up at me with wide, pleading, tear-filled eyes. She said they realized they had been far too harsh on me during the reading of the will. She said Julian desperately wanted to make things right and bring the family back together where we belonged. Then the tears flowed even heavier as she reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a certified bank check. It was written out for $50,000. She slid it slowly across my coffee table, pushing it toward me like a peace offering. She told me that Julian wanted to buy Breyer Holdings back from me right now today. She claimed with a breaking voice that they just wanted to clean up the abandoned lot and build a beautiful small community garden to honor my late parents' spiritual legacy. She begged me to take the money and sign the transfer papers immediately, saying it would finally heal the family and save Julian from total public ruin. It was the absolute classic weaponization of white tears, a performance designed specifically to make me feel overwhelmingly guilty and force me to yield out of a sense of misplaced empathy and familial duty. I did not reach for the check. I did not offer her a tissue. I simply looked at the piece of paper resting on the table, and then I looked slowly back up at Brittany. My eyes drifted deliberately down to her neck. Resting prominently against her collarbone, just visible above the neckline of her oversized sweater, was a distinct vintage diamond pendant. It was my mother's absolute favorite necklace, the one she had explicitly promised to me when I was a teenager, the one I was supposed to wear on my wedding day. I stared at the diamonds glinting harshly in the apartment light. "You really think I am that stupid?" I asked. my voice dangerously quiet and completely devoid of emotion. Brittany's lower lip quivered violently as she tried desperately to maintain the innocent victim persona, asking me what I meant and insisting through fresh tears that she was just trying to help me get back on my feet after losing my job. I leaned forward, picked up the $50,000 bank check, and tore it neatly in half right down the center. I dropped the torn pieces onto the floor between us. You sat at my dining table eating food I bought while wearing my mother's jewelry that you took before her body was even cold, I said, refusing to break eye contact for a single second. You mocked me in the lawyer's office. You joyfully evicted me from my home. You cheered while Julian tried to permanently destroy my professional career and reputation. And now you sit here weeping and expect me to believe you suddenly want to build a community garden for $50,000. Get out of my apartment. The fragile, innocent victim mask shattered into a million pieces in an instant. Brittany's face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She stood up abruptly, her fists clenched tightly at her sides, her voice entirely losing all of its soft, trembling quality. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous failure, and that I would deeply regret turning down their generous charity. She yelled that I was nothing without the family name, and that Julian would find a way to take the land from me anyway. I simply walked over, opened my front door wide, and waited in absolute silence for her to walk out. The moment she stomped past me and the door clicked shut, I immediately walked to my computer. I ordered a high-definition stealth surveillance system with infrared night vision and remote cellular uploading for the vacant lot. I knew exactly how my brother operated. If they could not manipulate me into selling the land, they would try to completely ruin it. Julian was profoundly arrogant, but he was also entirely predictable. When he felt cornered, he always used the church congregation as his personal weapon. He knew the commercial real estate laws in Atlanta perfectly. He knew that property owners were held strictly liable for any environmental hazards on their land. If the Environmental Protection Agency found severe toxic waste on a commercial property, they could levy devastating daily fines that ran into the tens of thousands of dollars until the site was fully remediated. A massive environmental violation would completely bankrupt me, forcing me to forfeit the property to the city or sell it back to him for absolute pennies just to escape the crushing federal debt. Late that same night, Julian mobilized a large group of blindly loyal church volunteers. He told them they were doing a holy and necessary cleanup of the church's old, dilapidated storage facilities. Under the heavy cover of darkness, 3 large passenger vans bearing the megachurch's bright golden logo backed slowly into the overgrown, trash-filled lot of Breyer Holdings. The volunteers, acting completely under their pastor's direct trusted orders, unloaded dozens of rusted industrial barrels. They dumped hundreds of gallons of toxic chemical solvents, old peeling lead-based paint, and hazardous construction debris directly onto the bare soil. They smashed old asbestos tiles and left heavy plastic bags full of dangerous medical waste from a defunct health clinic the church had purchased years ago. They turned the exact epicenter of a $36 million technology development into a highly toxic, illegal biohazard zone. They drove away into the night, completely convinced they were doing the Lord's righteous work for their beloved and holy pastor. The hidden motion sensors on my newly installed security cameras sent immediate silent alerts directly to my phone. I woke up at 2 in the morning, sitting in the dark of my apartment, and watched the crisp, high-definition infrared footage streaming live to my screen. I watched Julian's personal church vans dumping hazardous chemical waste all over my valuable property. I saw the distinct license plates. I saw the massive church logos painted on the side doors. I clearly saw the faces of the senior deacons doing the heavy lifting. I did not panic. I did not drive down to the lot to try and stop them or clean up the horrible mess. I definitely did not call the Environmental Protection Agency. Doing that would only entangle my property in years of restrictive bureaucratic red tape and completely ruin the pending Silicon Valley sale. Instead, I calmly downloaded the video files, saving multiple backups to secure cloud servers. I waited until the sun came up and then I made a very specific phone call to a prominent investigative journalist in Atlanta, a reporter widely known for aggressively destroying corrupt politicians and exposing corporate scandals. I sent him the high-resolution footage, along with verified copies of the property deed. I did not frame the situation as a petty family dispute over a contested will. I framed it as something much more explosive and impossible for the media to ignore. I reported a targeted, malicious environmental hate crime against a newly established Black-owned business property located right in the heart of a historic minority neighborhood. I told the journalist that a powerful, wealthy local institution was illegally trying to poison the community soil to drive out a small business owner. By 10 o'clock the next morning, 6 different news vans with their massive satellite dishes extended had descended upon Julian's megachurch parking lot, their cameras rolling live right in the middle of his heavily promoted community prayer breakfast. The live television broadcast was absolutely ruthless. Reporters thrust heavy microphones directly into Julian's face as he stood frozen at the head of the opulent banquet table. They demanded to know why a commercial van legally registered to his ministry was caught on high-definition infrared footage dumping toxic chemical waste onto a property owned by a Black woman. Julian tried to use his booming, charismatic pulpit voice to command the room and restore order, but the reporters did not care about his spiritual authority. They cared about the blatant Environmental Protection Agency violations and the glaring optics of a wealthy, influential megachurch attacking a small independent business owner. The heavily promoted community prayer breakfast completely dissolved into a chaotic stampede. Wealthy donors and local politicians covered their faces with their suit jackets as they rushed to their luxury vehicles, refusing to be associated with a federal environmental hate crime. Brittany, who had spent weeks planning her outfit for the breakfast, hid behind a floral arrangement, frantically trying to delete the promotional live stream from her social media accounts while hyperventilating. Within an hour, Julian was forcefully dragged into the private executive boardroom of the church. The senior elders who had blindly followed my parents for decades were sitting around the long, polished oak table, looking absolutely horrified. They had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of community uplift, and now their newly inaugurated pastor was the lead story on every local news network for poisoning the very community they claimed to serve and protect. The head of the elder board, a stern man who had always looked the other way when my parents skimmed from the collection plates, pounded his fist on the table until the wood rattled. He told Julian that the church administrative office was already fielding aggressive calls from federal environmental regulators. The strict financial penalties for dumping hazardous medical waste and highly toxic solvents would easily exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars, crushing the church's operating budget. He gave Julian an explicit, unyielding ultimatum. Resolve the public scandal, pay the environmental fines, and make this nightmare disappear within the week, or the board would officially strip him of his pastoral title, seize his remaining church assets, and force him to vacate the pulpit entirely. Julian was drowning in a harsh reality he could not charm his way out of. The secret $1.8 million mortgage on his inherited estate was already suffocating him financially. And now he was facing the complete loss of his 6-figure church salary and his ultimate source of social power. He retreated to his private pastoral office, locked the heavy door, and closed the blinds. He did not drop to his knees to pray for guidance or seek redemption. He logged directly into the church banking portals. He bypassed the standard dual signature protocols that my parents had conveniently established and subsequently ignored for years. With shaking hands, he wired a massive sum of money directly from the congregation tithe accounts. He took the sacred money meant for the community food pantry and the youth scholarship fund and used it to put a massive retainer on the most ruthless, aggressive probate attorney in the state of Georgia. He knew he could not defeat me in the court of public opinion, so he decided to drag me into a brutal legal war of attrition. While Julian was frantically stealing from his own congregation, I was sitting at the polished glass dining table in my new minimalist downtown apartment. My morning coffee was still warm when a secure private courier knocked loudly on my door. He handed me a thick sealed envelope bearing the embossed gold foil logo of the Silicon Valley technology conglomerate. I signed for the package and opened it carefully, my hands remarkably steady. Inside was the formal commercial purchase agreement, $36 million printed in clear, bold ink. It was the absolute culmination of everything I had endured. It was tangible proof of my value. It was undeniable freedom. But less than 2 hours later, a different knock echoed through my apartment. This time, it was a stern process server handing me a stack of heavily stamped legal documents. Julian had officially filed an emergency petition in the county probate court. The dense legal paperwork maliciously alleged that our late parents, Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne, were completely mentally unfit and suffering from severe cognitive decline when they transferred the ownership of Briar Holdings into my name. Julian's ruthless attorney had filed an immediate injunction effectively freezing all assets associated with the limited liability company. The tech company could not legally purchase the land or transfer the $36 million, while the ownership was actively contested in probate court. Julian had weaponized the legal system to hold my massive contract hostage. He was betting heavily that I would panic. He was betting that the tech company would walk away from the deal rather than wait out a lengthy, complicated court battle. He was betting that I was still the quiet, obedient sister who would fold under the intense pressure of a prolonged public family war. He was entirely wrong. I did not panic. I simply opened my laptop, accessed my firm's proprietary commercial real estate databases, and began running deep background checks on the commercial properties surrounding his megachurch. Julian could not wait for the legal process to play out naturally. His massive ego demanded that he see me break in person. He tracked me down 3 nights later at an exclusive high-end steakhouse in the financial district. I was sitting alone in a quiet, dimly lit leather booth, reviewing corporate tax structures for my firm, when Julian abruptly slid into the seat directly across from me. He looked physically deteriorating. His normally pristine, tailored suit was visibly wrinkled, and there were dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. The effortless arrogance that usually radiated from him had been replaced by a manic, desperate energy. He did not bother looking at a menu or acknowledging the waiter. He slammed a thick manila folder onto the table next to my water glass. He told me that the probate freeze was just the beginning of my nightmare. He claimed his lawyers were going to keep the land tied up in vicious litigation for the next decade until I was completely bankrupt from mounting legal fees. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He unlocked the screen, pushed the volume to the maximum, and pressed play on an audio file. The voice of our late mother filled the quiet space between us. Her voice sounded thin, terrified, and trembling. In the recording, she was crying hysterically, pleading for someone to stop hurting her, begging for help, and claiming that her daughter was keeping her locked in a dark room and deliberately stealing her medication. I stared at Julian as the horrifying audio played. He had hired someone to digitally alter and splice together old voicemails and videos of my mother, creating a completely fabricated recording that made it sound like I was guilty of horrific elder abuse. During her final agonizing months, I was the only one changing her bedding, managing her hospice care, and administering her actual treatments while Julian was out partying on the church's dime. Now he was using her digitized voice to blackmail me. Julian leaned across the table, his eyes wide and frantic. He told me that Brittany had already prepared a massive coordinated social media campaign to release the audio to the public. He threatened to send the recording directly to the state accounting board to have my forensic accounting license permanently revoked, ruining my career forever. He pointed a shaking finger at the manila folder he had dropped on the table. He said the folder contained an irrevocable settlement agreement. If I signed over total ownership of Briar Holdings to him, he would drop the probate suit and delete the fake audio recording. He promised to give me $50,000 for my trouble, just like Brittany had previously offered. He sat back in the leather booth, crossing his arms, breathing heavily and waiting for me to surrender. I slowly picked up my linen napkin and elegantly wiped the corners of my mouth. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my dedicated caregiving. I did not attempt to justify my love for our parents to a man who possessed absolutely no moral compass. I simply raised my right hand and signaled for our waiter. The waiter approached immediately holding a sleek black leather billfold. He did not hand the billfold to me. Following the specific instructions and the highly generous tip I had given him when Julian first walked through the restaurant doors, he placed the leather booklet directly in front of my brother. Julian scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes in absolute disgust. He told me that trying to make him pay for my expensive steak dinner was a pathetic little power play. He stated firmly that he was not leaving the booth until I signed the transfer documents. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water and calmly told him to open the billfold. Julian snatched the leather booklet and flipped it open, ready to throw a platinum credit card down. But there was no restaurant receipt inside. Inside the billfold were 3 pages of dense financial legal transfers highlighting the aggressive purchase of distressed commercial debt. Julian stared at the papers, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as he tried to comprehend the complex accounting terminology. I placed my glass down and looked at him with absolute chilling calm. I told him that as a senior partner at my prestigious forensic accounting firm, I have unrestricted access to massive portfolios of distressed commercial real estate debt. I explained that I bought the commercial debt for the very restaurant building we were currently sitting in just yesterday afternoon. But much more importantly, I explained I also bought the defaulted commercial debt on the 3-acre plot of land directly adjacent to his megachurch. The specific essential plot of land that his massive congregation currently used as their primary overflow parking lot every single Sunday. Julian stopped breathing. I leaned forward, resting my arms gracefully on the table. I told him that his church had been quietly defaulting on the parking lot lease payments for over a year, and the original owners were thrilled to sell the toxic debt to me for pennies on the dollar just to get it off their books. I now legally controlled the parking lot that housed hundreds of his parishioners' vehicles. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my terms. I told him that if his lawyer did not formally withdraw the probate petition by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I would exercise my absolute legal right as the primary debt holder. I would have a fleet of heavy commercial tow trucks descend upon his church during the absolute peak of his Sunday morning sermon. I would legally tow every single vehicle parked on my property, and I would ensure the local news cameras were there to film his wealthy, influential congregation being stranded in the street because their pastor failed to pay the rent. I added that I would also permanently evict this very restaurant, forcing him to find a new place to attempt his pathetic blackmail schemes. Julian stared at the aggressive debt ownership papers, his hands trembling violently against the pristine white tablecloth. The manic energy that had fueled his blackmail attempt completely evaporated, leaving only raw, suffocating panic. If the congregation cars were towed during a highly publicized Sunday service, the resulting outrage would give the church elders the final undeniable excuse they needed to strip him of his position immediately. He was completely trapped between the crushing environmental fines, the hidden estate mortgage, and now my total control over his vital parking infrastructure. He dropped the leather billfold onto the table, his chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow breaths. He looked down at the polished mahogany wood, entirely defeated. But then something shifted subtly in his posture. The absolute panic in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a dark, venomous gleam. A slow, ugly smile began to stretch across his face, curving his lips into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a single weathered piece of paper, slipping it deliberately across the table toward me. "You think you are so smart, Harper," he whispered, his voice dripping with triumphant poison. "You think you can just outmaneuver me with your little accounting tricks?" He tapped the weathered paper with his index finger. "Mom and Dad did not just give you that LLC. They never trusted you to manage anything of real value on your own. They left a secondary addendum buried deep in the church archives. There is a strict co-signer clause from 2015 explicitly tied to the foundational charter of Breyer Holdings. I looked down at the document, recognizing my father's bold, sweeping signature and the official state notary stamp. Julian leaned close to my face, his smile widening into something truly sinister. You cannot sell a single square foot of that land to the tech company without my authorized signature on the final contract. The weathered piece of paper rested on the polished mahogany table between us. I read the legal text carefully, my eyes scanning the dense bureaucratic paragraphs. It was a standard liability protection clause filed in 2015 when my parents first established Breyer Holdings as a blind shell company. They had structured the corporate bylaws so that no major physical asset could ever be liquidated, sold, or transferred without the explicit authorized signature of their golden child. Even in death, my parents had ensured Julian held the ultimate leash around my neck. Julian leaned back in the luxurious leather booth, signaling the waiter for a glass of heavily aged bourbon. He told me the tech company had already contacted his legal team regarding the title transfer. They were fully aware of the strict dual signature requirement. He laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the ambient noise of the upscale restaurant. He knew he finally had the leverage he desperately needed to save his crumbling empire. The reality of the standstill hit me the very next morning. The lead acquisition executive from the Silicon Valley technology firm called my personal cell phone. His tone was no longer polite or accommodating. It was strictly business, driven by corporate impatience. He informed me that his board of directors was rapidly losing patience with our messy family drama. They were building a multi-billion-dollar regional data center, and they did not have time to wait for a probate war to resolve. He stated very clearly that they had a fully surveyed backup location in Austin, Texas, entirely ready to purchase. He gave me exactly 7 days. I had one single week to produce a clean, legally binding contract with both my signature and Julian's signature, or they were walking away and taking their $36 million with them. Julian knew exactly how tight the deadline was. When I called him later that afternoon to negotiate, his demands were completely unhinged. He told me he would gladly sign the transfer papers, but only if I legally forfeited 90% of the total payout directly to his personal accounts. He demanded over $32 million. He wanted to use my inheritance to completely pay off his secret historic estate mortgage, to silence the furious church board, and to endlessly fund his luxury lifestyle, leaving me with nothing but scraps. I hung up the phone without giving him the satisfaction of an answer. 3 days passed as the massive tech deadline loomed closer. Julian was growing frantic for positive publicity. The local media was still ruthlessly investigating the illegal dumping of toxic waste on my property, and the church board was breathing heavily down his neck. To distract the public and pacify his wealthy donors, Julian poured what little liquid cash he had left into hosting the annual Faithful Hearts Charity Gala. It was a massive black tie event held in the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive downtown hotel. 500 of Atlanta's most elite citizens were scheduled to attend, including politicians, wealthy business owners, and influential community leaders. He sent a custom courier to my apartment, delivering a handwritten gold-embossed invitation. He wanted me there. He did not want to make peace. He wanted to trap me. I arrived at the charity gala wearing a sleek floor-length emerald gown projecting absolute unshakable confidence. The ballroom was stunning, dripping in heavy crystal chandeliers and thousands of white roses. Julian and Brittany were working the room, shaking hands and flashing brilliant practice smiles for the press cameras. When Julian saw me enter through the heavy oak doors, his eyes lit up with a dark, predatory gleam. He immediately walked up to the main stage and tapped the microphone, demanding the room's attention. The soft jazz music faded out, and 500 powerful people turned their eyes to the pulpit. Julian began speaking with that deep, resonant pastoral voice he had perfected over years of mirroring our Father. He spoke eloquently about the importance of family. He spoke about the painful tragedy of losing our beloved parents and the incredibly heavy burden of grief that can sometimes drive siblings apart. He told the breathless, massive crowd that tonight was not just about raising charity funds, but about healing deep spiritual and familial wounds. He looked directly at me standing in the back of the room and extended his open hand. He publicly invited his beloved sister to join him on stage. He announced to the audience that tonight we were going to demonstrate true unity. He was framing the entire moment as a beautiful spiritual reconciliation. It was a brilliant, calculated trap. If I refused to go on stage, I would look like the bitter, angry, crazy sister rejecting his public grace. If I went up there, he was going to force me to agree to his financial terms in front of the entire city. I did not hesitate. I walked slowly up the carpeted steps and crossed the wide stage. Julian pulled me into a tight, aggressive embrace, wrapping his arms around me, while the crowd erupted into thunderous standing applause. But as the press cameras flashed wildly, his grip tightened painfully around my arms, digging into my skin. He leaned his mouth close to my ear, his warm breath hitting my neck. He did not speak words of love or reconciliation. He whispered his ultimate threat. He told me that if I did not sign the contract granting him 90% of the tech money tomorrow morning, he was going to completely destroy the last shred of my life. He whispered that he was going to tell the church board, the police, and the media the fake truth about the night our father died. My blood ran completely cold. The official public story was that Bishop Ezekiel had suffered a sudden tragic heart attack while driving home from a late-night prayer vigil. The real story was a dark, heavily guarded family secret. Our father was a severe functioning alcoholic who had been drinking heavily in his private study that night. Julian had been the one drinking with him. Julian had been the one who handed him the keys when he was far too intoxicated to stand. When the car wrapped around a concrete highway pillar, Julian had used his massive church influence to illegally pay off the local medical examiner and keep the toxicology report permanently buried to protect the Holy Family image. Now, standing on that brightly lit stage, Julian whispered that he had fabricated evidence proving I was the one who supplied the alcohol. He threatened to publicly claim that I intentionally got our father drunk because I hated his ministry. He was willing to frame me for manslaughter just to extort the $36 million. He pulled back from the tight hug, smiling radiantly for the cheering audience. He handed me the microphone, fully expecting me to play my submissive role, to publicly yield and declare my unwavering loyalty to him and his church. I took the cold metal microphone in my hand. I looked out at the sea of expectant, wealthy faces. I looked at Brittany, who was dabbing fake tears from her eyes in the front row, playing the perfect emotional wife. Then I looked at the massive digital projector screen hanging directly behind Julian, which was currently displaying the Golden Church logo. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out my digital remote. I had spent the entire afternoon bypassing the hotel's highly unsecure audiovisual network using a simple wireless casting tool. I pressed the central button. The projector screen flickered wildly. The golden Holy Cross vanished. In its place, a massive high-definition image of Julian's highly classified personal banking statements appeared for all 500 guests to read. The ballroom fell into an absolute dead silence. Julian turned around to look at the screen, and the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice was dangerously calm and amplified perfectly through the towering ballroom speakers. I told the audience that my brother was an incredibly generous man. I directed their attention to the highlighted yellow transactions on the massive screen behind us. I explained that Julian was so absolutely dedicated to the community that he had personally withdrawn $200,000 directly from the megachurch's sacred restricted orphanage fund. A low rumble of shock began to spread through the crowd. I pressed the remote button again. The screen changed to a brilliant photograph of a sleek, 80-foot luxury yacht docked in a private, expensive marina in Miami, Florida, followed immediately by the official state registration deed. I told the audience that Julian had used the charity money explicitly meant for the city's most vulnerable children to purchase a luxury party boat registered under a fake shell company in Brittany's name. I read the exact bank routing numbers aloud, echoing through the room. I pointed out the specific dates matching them perfectly to the exact weeks when Julian had stood at his pulpit, crying and begging the congregation to dig deeper into their pockets to save the failing orphanage. Total chaos erupted in the ballroom. Wealthy donors began shouting in outrage. A prominent city councilwoman sitting in the front row threw her linen napkin onto the table and loudly demanded an explanation. Flashbulbs went off rapidly as reporters scrambled over each other to capture the banking records displayed on the screen. Julian lunged forward violently, trying to snatch the microphone from my hands, but I easily stepped aside, letting his aggressive momentum carry him awkwardly across the stage. He was completely exposed. The holy illusion was shattered beyond any hope of repair. He had tried to blackmail me with a fabricated tragedy about our father, so I responded with absolute documented reality about his own greed. Before the furious crowd could completely rush the stage, Brittany scrambled up the stairs. She totally abandoned her elegant, sophisticated poise. She forcefully grabbed the spare microphone from the wooden podium. She began screaming over the loud roar of the crowd. She weaponized her delicate, fragile image instantly. She cried hysterically, yelling that her sister-in-law was having a severe psychotic break. She told the frantic audience that I had been suffering from dangerous mental delusions since our parents' passing. She screamed that the bank documents on the screen were forged by a sick, grieving mind, and she begged the crowd to show Christian compassion for my severe mental illness. She played the frantic, terrified victim so perfectly that the hotel security guards actually hesitated, unsure of who the real threat in the room was. Her dramatic performance created just enough confusion for Julian's private security team to rush the stage, surround them both, and drag them out the back exit away from the furious donors. I left the hotel calmly, walking through the chaotic lobby and driving back to my apartment. I knew I had won the public battle. I had exposed his theft and ruined his leverage, but Julian was a cornered, desperate animal, losing everything he had ever known. I did not realize how incredibly far he was willing to go to completely silence me and steal the land. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of aggressive, heavy pounding on my apartment door. It was not a courier delivering documents. It was two uniformed city police officers, accompanied by three serious-looking medical technicians holding a heavy canvas restraint bag. When I opened the door, the lead officer informed me that they had received an emergency petition filed overnight. Julian had officially invoked the state laws for an involuntary psychiatric hold. He had legally declared me an immediate physical danger to myself and others, citing my actions at the gala as proof of a violent psychotic break. I calmly tried to explain that this was a retaliatory tactic over a massive financial dispute, but the lead medical technician stepped forward and handed me a signed official clinical document. I read the paperwork and my heart stopped beating. It was a formal psychiatric evaluation certifying that I was suffering from violent paranoid schizophrenia. It detailed completely fabricated episodes of self-harm and terrifying violent outbursts that never happened. And at the bottom of the final page was the signature of Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans was a highly respected local psychiatrist, but more importantly, he was a loyal, devoted senior elder on the board of Julian's megachurch. Julian had used his vast religious influence to secure a fake medical mandate from a corrupt doctor. The terrifying reality of the trap closed around me. Julian was having me committed to a locked state psychiatric ward to legally incapacitate me. He knew that if I was officially declared mentally incompetent by a medical professional, my signature would no longer be required to sell the $36 million property. The power of attorney would automatically default to my next of kin. It would default to him. The police officers stepped into my apartment, placing their hands on their utility belts, telling me I had no choice but to come with them peacefully, or they would use force. I did not fight the officers. Years of investigating corporate fraud and dealing with hostile executives had taught me a vital lesson about power. Resisting an unjust authority in the heat of the moment only provides them with the exact ammunition they need to legally validate their false narrative. If I screamed or fought back or desperately tried to explain the $36 million technology deal, I would sound exactly like the dangerous paranoid schizophrenic Julian claimed I was. I calmly held out my hands, and allowed the medical technicians to guide me out of my pristine apartment and into the back of the waiting state medical transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The ride to the state psychiatric facility was cold, silent, and deeply terrifying. Julian thought the sterile white walls and the heavily medicated environment of the locked ward would permanently break my spirit. He thought that being forcibly stripped of my personal belongings, my mobile phone, and my tailored business suits would reduce me to a hysterical, broken woman. He wanted me to feel entirely powerless so that I would beg for my freedom in exchange for the Briar Holdings deed. For 3 agonizing days, I was subjected to the cold clinical detachment of the facility staff. They spoke to me in slow, patronizing tones, trying to force heavy antipsychotic medications upon me. I calmly and continuously refused the pills, demanding instead that they draw my blood every single morning to establish a verified medical record, proving my system was entirely clean of any narcotics or psychiatric drugs. I kept my posture straight, my voice perfectly level, and my emotions entirely locked away. I knew Julian's timeline perfectly. I knew the law dictated that I must be granted an emergency mental fitness hearing within 72 hours of an involuntary hold. I used my one legally mandated phone call to reach out to the managing partner of my accounting firm, who immediately dispatched the most ruthless corporate defense attorney in Atlanta to represent me. The emergency hearing took place on the morning of the 7th day since the tech company issued their absolute deadline. I was escorted into a drab, dimly lit, wood-paneled probate courtroom by 2 state bailiffs. The air in the room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The presiding magistrate was Judge Harrison, an older, stern man known for his rigid adherence to the law and his deep ties to the local religious community. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, looking like a picture of absolute tragic perfection, were Julian and Brittany. Julian wore his most humble, dark, pastoral suit, holding a leather-bound Bible in his hands. Brittany wore a modest pastel dress with her blonde hair pulled back simply to emphasize her fragile, innocent face. They looked exactly like a loving, deeply concerned family, trying to save their sick sister from herself. I was seated at the defense table wearing borrowed standard-issue hospital scrubs, but I carried myself with the absolute unshakable dignity of a senior partner walking into a boardroom. The hearing began, and Julian was called to the witness stand first. His performance was a sickening masterclass in public manipulation and manufactured grief. He spoke to the judge with his polished, resonant pulpit voice, carefully wiping a single tear from his eye. He testified that the tragic sudden loss of our parents had completely shattered my mind. He looked at me with deep fake pity and told the judge that I had been acting erratically for months, aggressively lashing out at church members and hoarding garbage. He claimed that the massive technology deal was nothing more than a grandiose paranoid delusion I had invented to cope with my recent unemployment. He spun a beautiful, tragic web of lies, framing his attempt to seize control of my assets as a desperate act of brotherly love to prevent me from ruining my own life. Then it was Brittany's turn to take the stand. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands, playing the ultimate victim card. It was the absolute weaponization of white tears, a tactic she had used against me for years to paint me as an angry, aggressive black woman whenever I dared to hold her accountable. She dabbed at her eyes carefully, ensuring she did not ruin her expensive mascara. She testified with a shaking breath that she was terrified of me. She claimed that I had shown up at her house screaming violently at shadows and physically threatening her life over imaginary real estate contracts. She cried softly, telling the judge that she could not sleep at night, knowing I was out there untreated and dangerous. She presented Dr. Evans' fraudulent psychiatric report as the ultimate proof of my severe mental decline. She painted herself as a terrified, innocent sister-in-law who was simply trying to get me the medical help I so desperately needed. Judge Harrison looked down at me from his elevated bench, his expression heavy with sympathetic judgment. He asked my attorney if we had any medical witnesses to counter the signed psychiatric evaluation provided by a highly respected church elder. My attorney simply smiled and deferred to me. I stood up from the defense table, smoothing the wrinkles of my cotton hospital scrubs. I told the judge that I did not need a competing medical professional to prove my sanity, because as a senior forensic accountant, I preferred to rely on absolute digital evidence. I explained that forensic auditing is not just about tracking hidden bank accounts or corporate tax fraud. It is about establishing undeniable timelines and tracking human behavior with irrefutable data. I asked the bailiff to enter Defense Exhibit A into the court record. My attorney handed a sleek silver tablet to the bailiff, who connected it to the large digital display monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. I turned to look directly at Brittany, who was still sitting on the witness stand, softly clutching her tissue. I told the judge that the footage he was about to see was unedited raw security video downloaded directly from the encrypted cloud server attached to the hidden Ring camera on my apartment door. I pressed the remote button, and the courtroom monitor flickered to life. The high-definition video showed the hallway outside my apartment door on the exact morning Brittany had come to visit me with her fake $50,000 settlement check. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as the footage played. They watched Brittany stomp out of my apartment after I rejected her pathetic offer and threw her out. The moment my door clicked shut in the video, the fragile, innocent victim mask she had just worn on the witness stand completely evaporated. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The court audio captured every single sound perfectly. They watched her pull her expensive smartphone from her oversized designer bag and dial a number. They heard her vicious, arrogant laughter echoing clearly in the empty hallway. And then they heard the exact words she spoke into the phone. "I paid Dr. Evans 10 grand. She laughed, her voice dripping with venomous triumph on the recording. "We are going to lock that bitch in a psych ward and take the money." Julian was right, it was so easy. The silence in the courtroom was so profound and heavy, it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. I paused the video, leaving the frozen image of Brittany's wicked laughing face glaring down from the massive monitor. I turned slowly back to the witness stand. Brittany was no longer crying. She was sitting completely paralyzed, staring at the screen with her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. Julian had physically recoiled in his chair at the plaintiff's table, his face draining of all color, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His perfect pastoral illusion had just been completely incinerated by a simple hidden camera. Judge Harrison's face turned a dangerous, violent shade of crimson. He gripped his wooden gavel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The absolute fury radiating from the bench was palpable. He slammed the gavel down with a deafening crack that made everyone in the room jump. He did not just throw out the involuntary psychiatric hold. He completely dismantled my brother and his wife. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Brittany, ordering her to remain completely silent as she tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse. He announced that he was immediately referring her and Dr. Evans to the district attorney for severe felony perjury charges and medical fraud. He looked at Julian with utter, absolute disgust, threatening to have the state investigate his megachurch for criminal conspiracy and financial extortion. Brittany began to hyperventilate loudly in the witness box. She gripped the wooden railing, her chest heaving as the reality of her destroyed life crashed down upon her. She realized in that exact moment that her carefully curated, lucrative social media influencer career was permanently over. She would no longer be known as the flawless, blessed pastor's wife. She would be nationally known as a desperate, manipulative criminal who bribed a doctor to falsely imprison her black sister-in-law just to steal her rightful inheritance. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, but this time the tears were absolutely real, and no one in the courtroom offered her an ounce of sympathy. The judge formally ordered my immediate release and instructed the bailiffs to secure the video drive as official state evidence. I did not wait for formal dismissals. I gathered my legal pad, thanked my attorney, and walked out of the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. I was a free woman. The oppressive weight of the psychiatric ward, the terrifying gaslighting, the constant attempts to break my mind, it was all completely over. I pushed through the front doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the warm, brilliant Atlanta afternoon sun. The heat felt incredible against my skin. I took a deep cleansing breath, feeling the absolute power of my own unshakable truth. But as I began walking down the wide concrete steps toward the street, I heard the heavy, frantic clicking of dress shoes rushing up behind me. I turned around to see Julian stalking toward me. His pastoral dignity was entirely gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wild with a dark, terrifying desperation. His reputation was in absolute ashes. His church board was undoubtedly going to strip him of his title the moment the news of the perjury and medical fraud charges leaked. He was facing total financial and social annihilation. Julian cornered me at the bottom of the courthouse steps, blocking my path to the sidewalk. He did not look angry anymore. He looked completely unhinged. A wicked, desperate smile spread slowly across his face, twisting his features into something unrecognizable. He looked down at his expensive gold watch, and then back up at me. "You beat the psych hold, Harper," he whispered, his voice trembling with a manic, erratic energy. "You exposed Brittany. You exposed the doctor. You are so incredibly smart. But you forgot to look at the clock." He took a step closer, invading my personal space, his smile growing wider and more deranged. "The 7-day deadline from the tech company expires at exactly 5 o'clock today," he said, emphasizing every single word. "You have exactly 3 hours left, and you still cannot legally sell that land or collect a single dime without my authorized signature on the final contract." He leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee and bitter fear on his breath. He delivered his final, absolute ultimatum. "If you do not electronically transfer 90% of the payout agreement to my accounts right now, I will walk away and let the clock run out. The tech company will move their development to Texas, and the $36 million is gone forever. You will be left with nothing but a toxic waste dump and a pile of legal fees. I am already ruined. I have absolutely nothing left to lose, Harper. Do you?" I stood there on the hot concrete of the courthouse steps, staring into the frantic eyes of my brother. The midday sun beat down on my borrowed hospital scrubs, making me acutely aware of how broken I appeared on the outside. Julian was breathing heavily, waiting for my collapse. I looked at the digital clock on my phone. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 hours until the Silicon Valley executives completely pulled their offer and walked away. I needed Julian to believe he had utterly broken my spirit. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my breathing to become shallow and uneven, mimicking the exact panic he was projecting. I looked down at the pavement and let a single tear fall. I told him he won. I told him I could not lose the only inheritance our parents had actually left me. Julian exhaled a sharp, victorious laugh. I told him to have his lawyers meet me at the downtown City Hall administrative offices in exactly 1 hour. I told him to bring the internal family transfer documents, and I would sign over the 90% he demanded. I turned and walked away toward the transit station, leaving him to revel in his perceived dominance. But as I walked, my tears instantly dried. Julian was a parasite who only saw what he wanted to see. He only saw the $36 million payout. He was entirely blinded by his own insatiable greed. Forensic accounting is not just about tracking numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about understanding the psychology of arrogance. Arrogant people never read the fine print when they think they have already won. I arrived at the massive marble columns of City Hall 30 minutes early. I needed the time to center myself and prepare for the final act of this suffocating family play. I waited in the grand rotunda, watching the heavy brass doors. At exactly 2:45, Julian and Brittany made their grand entrance. They did not look like people who were facing federal perjury charges or catastrophic financial ruin. They looked like royalty, arriving for a coronation. Julian wore a pristine, bespoke navy suit with a silk tie that probably cost more than my first car. Brittany was draped in an immaculate white designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly blown out. The sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking. Less than an hour ago, Brittany had been hyperventilating in a courtroom facing criminal charges for faking my psychiatric hold. Now she was holding her smartphone up high, mounted on a sleek stabilization gimbal, actively live streaming to her thousands of devoted followers. I could hear her sickeningly sweet voice echoing off the marble walls as they approached. She was looking directly into the camera lens, thanking God for his unending grace and favor. She told her followers that the Lord had blessed their ministry with a miraculous multi-million-dollar technology deal. She spun a beautiful, flawless narrative about generational wealth and divine timing, completely omitting the fact that she had just tried to have me locked in a psychiatric ward to steal it. She was practically vibrating with excitement, entirely convinced that they were about to walk out of this building with over $32 million in pure liquid cash. Julian walked beside her with his chest puffed out, soaking in the digital adoration of her live stream audience. They spotted me standing near the elevators in my wrinkled scrubs, and Julian's face broke into a cruel, self-satisfied smirk. We took the elevator up to the fourth-floor executive suites in complete silence. Brittany kept her camera rolling the entire time, whispering prayers of gratitude to her audience. We entered the reserved conference room. The atmosphere was immediately tense and strictly professional. Sitting around the long mahogany table were three senior executives from the Silicon Valley tech firm, flanked by two very serious corporate attorneys. They were all wearing sharp, dark suits and looking incredibly impatient. When Julian walked into the room, he immediately took absolute control. He did not introduce me. He strode right up to the lead executive and aggressively shook his hand, pulling him into a familiar, charismatic embrace. He projected the absolute confidence of a man who owned the entire world. He loudly apologized for the delay, blaming it on trivial family misunderstandings. Then he gestured dismissively toward me, where I stood quietly by the door. He told the tech executives that I was just the family bookkeeper. He laughed a deep booming sound and claimed that he was the real mastermind behind this entire real estate acquisition. He told them that he had graciously allowed his little sister to handle the tedious administrative paperwork, but that he was the one who had the grand vision for the land. The executives exchanged highly uncomfortable glances. They were seasoned corporate negotiators, and they could clearly read the toxic dynamic in the room. But they did not care about our family trauma. They only cared about securing the regional data center grid before their 5 o'clock deadline. The lead executive simply nodded politely and tapped a thick stack of documents resting in the center of the table. He said they had the final purchase agreements ready for both signatures and that the wire transfer was queued up with their bank awaiting authorization. Julian's ruthless probate attorney, a shark in a gray pinstripe suit, stepped forward and placed a second, much thinner document right next to the tech company contract. This was the internal family agreement Julian had demanded, the legal instrument that would officially transfer the majority of the wealth into his hands. Julian snapped his fingers, pointing at the chair next to the documents. He ordered me to sit down and sign it. I walked slowly to the heavy leather chair. I could feel the intense gaze of every man in the room bearing down on me. Brittany was standing in the corner, her phone angled perfectly to capture my total submission for her audience. I sat down and picked up the internal family agreement. I read the text very carefully, letting my eyes scan every single line of the dense legal jargon. Julian's lawyer had drafted it exactly as Julian had demanded, with absolute aggressive greed. The specific clause was highlighted in bold black ink. It stated clearly that by signing this document, Julian assumes 90% ownership control and liability of Breyer Holdings Limited Liability Company. It was a complete transfer of power and responsibility. I picked up the heavy silver pen resting on the table. I let my hand shake visibly. I looked up at Julian, my eyes wide and perfectly mimicking absolute terror. I let my breathing become shallow. Julian leaned over the table, placing both of his hands firmly on the wood, trapping me in my seat. He looked down at me with a look of pure, unfiltered contempt. He relished the fear he thought he saw in my eyes. He enjoyed breaking me in front of these powerful men. He leaned his face down until he was inches from my ear. "Sign it, loser," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. I swallowed hard, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and signed my name on the dotted line. The moment my pen lifted from the paper, Julian snatched the document away as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He handed it triumphantly to his lawyer, who quickly notarized it and sealed it in his briefcase. Julian then turned eagerly to the massive tech company purchase agreement. He did not bother reading a single word of the 70-page contract. He simply flipped to the very last page, grabbed the pen from my hand, and signed his name with a massive, arrogant flourish. The lead tech executive let out a long sigh of relief. He signed his portion, confirming the execution of the contract, and nodded to his attorneys. The $36 million transaction was officially secured. The money was locked in. Julian stood up tall, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He turned to me, looking at my wrinkled hospital scrubs like I was a piece of garbage he had just scraped off his shoe. "Now get out of my sight," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet conference room. "Go back to whatever miserable hole you live in, Harper. You are done here." He turned his back on me, preparing to celebrate with Brittany, who was already squealing quietly at her phone screen. But I did not stand up and run away crying. I did not lower my head in defeat. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The manufactured terror that had clouded my face completely vanished. It evaporated into the sterile air of the conference room. In its place, a cold, dead-eyed, predatory smile slowly stretched across my face. I looked at the back of my brother's expensive suit. "You might want to read the rest of the limited liability company ledger." "Pastor," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that made everyone in the room suddenly freeze. I watched the color rapidly drain from Julian's face as my words hung heavily in the sterile air of the conference room. He stared at me, his hand still hovering over the freshly signed purchase agreement. He tried to force a laugh, a nervous sputtering sound that failed to project any of his usual arrogant confidence. He asked me what ridiculous nonsense I was talking about, his voice wavering just enough to betray the sudden spike of panic rising in his chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of emotion. I simply reached down and clicked open the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick-bound stack of pristine financial documents and slid them directly across the polished mahogany table toward the lead tech executive. I told the executive that this was the clean, unencumbered title deed to the 3-acre property. I explained that I had spent the last 24 hours executing a highly complex corporate spin-off, legally separating the physical land asset entirely from the corporate entity of Breyer Holdings. The executive quickly reviewed the authenticated state seals and the binding survey attachments. He nodded sharply, signaling to his attorneys that the $36 million land purchase was completely clean and fully executed. The tech team immediately began packing their briefcases, snapping them shut with loud, definitive clicks. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the familial implosion they were currently witnessing. They stood up, smoothed their expensive suits, and swiftly exited the conference room, leaving the $36 million trust strictly in my individual name. I turned my attention fully back to my brother. I told Julian that when our parents mysteriously transferred Breyer Holdings into my name, during their final months, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. They had never trusted me with anything of value, and they certainly would not hand over a prime commercial real estate asset out of the goodness of their hearts. I told him that as a senior forensic accountant, my entire career is built on finding the hidden money that wealthy, powerful people desperately try to conceal. I explained that I had spent the last month doing deep forensic audits, quietly tearing apart the foundational charter and the encrypted financial histories of the shell company they had left me. I explained to Julian exactly how I had cracked our parents' encrypted files. I told him about the hidden servers physically locked in the basement of the megachurch administrative building. I spent sleepless nights tracing offshore routing numbers, digging through thousands of redacted ledger entries and uncovering buried domestic accounts that were perfectly designed to evade detection. I told him that Briar Holdings was never just a meaningless blind trust holding a vacant parking lot. It was the central operational artery of a massive financial sickness. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and revealed the horrifying truth about the holy empire our parents had built. I explained that Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne were not just charismatic spiritual leaders spreading a message of community uplift. They had been running a highly sophisticated, massive Ponzi scheme for the last 15 years. Julian stepped back, bumping hard into his heavy leather chair. He shook his head aggressively, refusing to process the words leaving my mouth. I kept my voice perfectly measured, delivering the facts like swinging a heavy iron hammer. I told Julian that our beloved saintly parents had systematically siphoned over $40 million directly from the megachurch's dedicated pension fund. They had mercilessly stolen the retirement savings of their most vulnerable, loyal elderly parishioners, the very people who trusted them with their mortal souls and their financial futures. I told him how they had siphoned the funds using hundreds of microtransactions, disguising the theft as routine church maintenance costs and overseas missionary expenses. Every time the congregation donated to build a new community center or fund a youth outreach program, our parents had routed the money straight into Briar Holdings. They funneled every single dime of that stolen money through the shell company to aggressively launder it clean. They used the company to fabricate entirely fake real estate losses, massive ghost charity donations to non-existent orphanages, and phantom community outreach programs, completely evading federal taxes for over a decade. I explained that when our parents realized federal regulators were beginning to quietly circle their accounts, they panicked. They knew the federal audits would eventually expose the missing $40 million and the decades of wire fraud. So they maliciously transferred the entire poisoned company into my name right before they died, hoping that my pristine professional reputation would shield the company from scrutiny, or at the very least, leave me holding the bag when the federal government finally came knocking. They intended for me to take the absolute fall for their crimes, while Julian got to inherit the pristine, unblemished church leadership and all the social power that came with it. Julian was physically shaking now, gripping the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles were bone white. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly. He stammered frantically, claiming that none of that mattered because I was still the primary owner of the company. He pointed a trembling finger at me, stating that I was the one going to federal prison because my name was on the foundational charter. I smiled that same dead predatory smile and pointed to the freshly signed internal family agreement sitting right in front of his ruthless gray-suited lawyer. I told him he was absolutely wrong. I reminded him that just 3 minutes ago, he had aggressively and legally demanded total, absolute control of the entire entity. I recited the exact contractual phrasing he and his high-priced lawyers had drafted to ensure I had absolutely no power left. Julian assumes 90% ownership control and liability of Briar Holdings Limited Liability Company. I explained the beautiful, flawless reality of the trap he had just blindly walked into, with his own massive ego leading the way. I told him that the tech company had just legally purchased the clean physical land, putting the $36 million into a secure external trust that I fully controlled. But the corporate entity itself, Briar Holdings, remained exactly where it was. And that entity still held the $40 million in stolen pension funds and 15 years of catastrophic criminal tax liability. And since he had just legally claimed 90% ownership of that specific entity with his own notarized signature, he was now legally and personally responsible for the entire massive federal crime. The absolute reality of his destruction struck him with the force of a freight train. He looked down at his own signature on the family agreement and let out a strangled, guttural gasp. The heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the wooden table. He dropped the contract, his hands shaking violently as his mind desperately tried to comprehend the absolute magnitude of what he had just done. He had spent weeks trying to destroy my life, steal my inheritance, and lock me in a psychiatric ward. In his blind, staggering arrogance, he had forced me to give him the very instrument of his own annihilation. His own high-priced lawyers had drafted the exact document that would send him to prison. The gray-suited lawyer slowly backed away from the table, realizing he had just legally bound his client to a $40 million federal fraud case. Julian was no longer just facing a ruined reputation or angry church elders. He was looking at decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The hidden historic estate mortgage and the toxic waste fines were absolutely nothing compared to $40 million in stolen church pensions. He had eagerly signed his own permanent death warrant. I looked over at Brittany. She was completely frozen in the corner of the room. The glowing screen of her smartphone was still actively broadcasting to her thousands of followers. The live comment feed was scrolling so fast it was a blur of text. Her devoted followers had heard every single word of my forensic breakdown. The digital hearts and praying hand emojis had completely vanished, replaced by hundreds of angry comments demanding to know where their grandparents' pension money went. They were flooding the feed with frantic, enraged questions about the stolen church funds and the massive tax fraud. Her face was incredibly ghostly pale, devoid of all her usual polished glamour. The flawless victim persona she had weaponized for years was entirely shattered in front of her entire digital audience. She reached up with a violently shaking hand and abruptly ended the live stream, severing the connection to her precious followers. She knew her glamorous influencer life was instantly, permanently vaporized. She would no longer be known as the flawless, blessed pastor's wife posting about divine favor and spiritual wealth. She was now married to a man entirely responsible for the greatest financial scandal in the history of the state. She stumbled backward until her back hit the conference room wall, sliding down slightly as her knees lost their strength. She began muttering to herself, frantically whispering that she had nothing to do with this, that she was just his wife, that she did not know anything about the stolen money. She was already mentally preparing to throw Julian entirely under the bus to save herself from federal prison. The absolute loyalty she had proudly preached to her followers completely evaporated the second real consequences entered the room. She looked at Julian not with love or support, but with absolute disgust and sheer terror. Julian could barely breathe. The custom-tailored suit that had looked so powerful just minutes ago now seemed to hang off him like a shroud. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, running down his face and soaking into his expensive silk collar. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely hollowed out by pure, suffocating terror. He tried to speak, to beg me to tear up the contract, to reverse the signature, to find a way to fix this horrific nightmare. He reached his hand out toward the document, but his lawyer quickly snatched the briefcase away, refusing to be a party to destroying a notarized legal agreement in front of witnesses. No words would come out of Julian's mouth. Only pathetic, broken, wheezing sounds escaped his throat. I calmly closed my briefcase and adjusted the strap on my shoulder, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. I told him that I had meticulously mapped every single fraudulent wire transfer, every faked invoice, and every offshore dummy corporation our parents had used. I had compiled a digital dossier so utterly comprehensive and legally bulletproof that no defense attorney on earth could ever dismantle it. And now, because of his own relentless greed, his name was officially permanently tied to it. I told him that his arrogance had always been his greatest weakness, and that he should have known better than to challenge a forensic accountant to a paper war. A sudden heavy movement outside the conference room caught my attention. I looked past Julian's trembling form toward the thick, frosted glass doors of the administrative suite. A dozen serious-looking men and women in dark windbreakers were aggressively marching down the corridor, moving in perfect synchronized formation, heading directly for our room. The heavy thud of their boots on the marble floors echoed loudly through the glass. The bold yellow letters, printed clearly across the backs of their jackets, spelled out IRS Criminal Investigation. They were moving with the absolute unyielding authority of federal agents who already had all the evidence they needed. I had anonymously forwarded the entire Breyer Holdings digital ledger to the regional director of the federal task force 3 days ago, perfectly timing their arrival with the execution of this exact contract. The lead federal agent pushed the brass doors wide open, stepping into the conference room with a deeply serious expression. He did not ask for permission to enter. He held up a thick stack of federal warrants stamped with red ink. The agents immediately fanned out across the room, securing the exits and stepping between Julian and his lawyers. The lead agent looked directly at Julian, asking him to confirm his identity as the primary owner and controlling entity of Breyer Holdings Limited Liability Company. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but he was completely paralyzed. His entire world, his wealth, his status, his absolute power had been entirely dismantled in less than 5 minutes. He was a broken, terrified shell of a man staring down the barrel of total federal annihilation. I stood quietly watching the federal agents surround the golden child of the family. The decades of being the scapegoat, the years of enduring their psychological torture, the absolute nightmare of the past few weeks had finally culminated in this exact moment of perfect structural justice. I looked back at my brother and whispered quietly, so only he could hear over the rushing panic in his own ears. I told him he better start praying because his audit had officially begun. The lead IRS agent stood at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating an aura of absolute unyielding federal authority. He slammed a thick, dense stack of federal warrants down onto the polished wood, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent conference room. He announced in a voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy that his team was executing an immediate federal seizure of all bank accounts, properties, and physical assets tied to the owners and managing directors of Breyer Holdings. He explained that the warrants covered massive systemic wire fraud, criminal tax evasion, and the meticulous laundering of $40 million in stolen megachurch pension funds. The sheer gravity of those words hung heavily in the sterile air, suffocating the room. The Silicon Valley tech executives who had retreated to the far wall watched the scene unfold in stunned, absolute silence. They were incredibly thankful that I had structured their purchase agreement to buy the physical land entirely separate from the toxic corporate shell. They realized in that terrifying moment that they had just narrowly avoided being entangled in one of the largest federal raids in state history. The corporate attorneys accompanying them quickly packed their briefcases and pressed their backs flat against the glass walls, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the catastrophic family implosion happening right in front of them. Julian finally snapped out of his catatonic shock. The terrifying reality of federal prison fractured whatever was left of his fake pastoral composure. He lunged forward, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. His perfectly tailored bespoke suit jacket pulled awkwardly across his shoulders as he began to scream at the top of his lungs. He shrieked that I was the one they needed to arrest immediately. He yelled that I was the senior forensic accountant, that I was the one who manipulated numbers for a living, and that I had maliciously orchestrated this entire criminal enterprise just to frame him. His voice cracked, jumping several octaves as he frantically tried to rewrite history in front of the armed federal agents. He claimed he was just a humble man of God, a simple, innocent pastor who had foolishly trusted his malicious, jealous sister to handle the complex family finances. He begged the lead agent to put the handcuffs on me, screaming that I had stolen the sacred church money and set an elaborate trap to ruin his holy ministry. He was sweating profusely, spittle flying from his lips as he completely abandoned his polished, charismatic persona. He reverted to a terrified, desperate child trying to blame his sibling for a broken vase. But this was not a broken vase. This was $40 million in federal fraud, and his desperate lies were completely useless against the mountain of digital evidence I had already provided to the government over the last several days. The lead IRS agent did not even flinch at Julian's theatrical screaming. He simply looked at my brother with cold, tired eyes that had seen hundreds of desperate white-collar criminals try to lie their way out of federal indictments. The agent reached down and picked up the thin internal family agreement that was resting on the table. It was the exact same document Julian had aggressively forced me to sign just minutes earlier. The ink of his arrogant signature was quite literally still drying on the page. The agent held the contract up, specifically pointing to the final page where Julian's massive, undeniable signature sat. The agent read the clause aloud, his voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. He stated that according to this legally binding notarized document, Julian had explicitly assumed 90% executive control ownership and all historical liabilities of Breyer Holdings. The agent looked Julian dead in the eye and explained that in the eyes of the federal government, Julian had just legally confessed to being the primary beneficiary and controlling mastermind of a $40 million money laundering operation. I stood calmly by my heavy leather chair and added my own final nail to his coffin. I told Julian that I had filed the corporate separation paperwork yesterday afternoon, officially removing my name from any liability associated with the shell company, exactly 24 hours before he aggressively demanded to take it over. I explained that I had given him exactly what he asked for. He wanted the company. He wanted the absolute control. And now he had the absolute catastrophic consequences that came with it. While Julian was gasping for air, gripping his chest as if he were having a genuine physical heart attack, Brittany realized that the ship was rapidly sinking, and she desperately needed to find a lifeboat. I watched her slowly backing away from the wall, her eyes darting frantically toward the frosted glass doors. She was trying to silently slip out of the conference room while the federal agents were entirely focused on her husband. When one of the female agents stepped sideways to block her path, Brittany instantly triggered her ultimate defense mechanism. She burst into violent, hysterical tears, crying her signature white tears in a desperate attempt to manipulate the federal agents. She threw her hands up in the air, shaking her head and sobbing that she was just a traditional supportive wife. She loudly declared that she had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing behind closed doors. Then her true, deeply ingrained racism and opportunistic malice completely spilled out for everyone to hear. She screamed that she did not know anything about this black church stuff or the stolen pension money. She desperately tried to distance her pristine white influencer image from our family and the very congregation that had funded her entire lavish lifestyle. She framed herself as a naive, innocent victim who had been maliciously tricked into marrying a criminal. She looked at Julian with pure, unadulterated revulsion, wiping her fake tears, and shouted that she was calling her lawyers right now to file for an immediate divorce. She told the federal agents she was leaving and demanded they get out of her way because her luxury brand could not possibly be associated with a federal raid. Her mobile phone attached to its sleek gimbal lay discarded on the plush carpet, still actively recording the audio of her entire cowardly betrayal. She took 2 aggressive steps toward the door, fully expecting her white tears and wealthy blonde aesthetic to grant her a free pass out of the consequences, just like they always had. But the female IRS agent did not move a single inch. Instead, the agent reached into her own dark windbreaker and pulled out a secondary folded warrant. She looked at Brittany with a cold, hard stare that completely shattered the influencer's fragile victim routine in an instant. The agent firmly told Brittany that she was not going anywhere. She explained that their forensic financial task force had already subpoenaed her personal banking records and the complex corporate filings for her luxury lifestyle brand. The agent stated clearly that they had absolute, undeniable proof showing Brittany had personally used the laundered funds from Breyer Holdings to secure massive fraudulent business loans for her social media empire. She had knowingly funneled millions of dollars of stolen church pension money to pay for her designer wardrobe, her luxury vacations, and her pristine fake online aesthetic. Brittany stopped breathing. Her tear-streaked face turned a horrifying shade of ghostly pale as the absolute reality of her situation hit her. She was not an innocent victim. She was a fully complicit federal co-conspirator who had built an entire digital kingdom on the backs of stolen retirement funds. The female agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed Brittany's wrists, pulling her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the quiet conference room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A second agent stepped behind Julian, grabbing his arms and pulling them behind his back, securing another pair of handcuffs around his wrists. Julian was openly weeping, now his knees buckling so much that the armed agents had to physically hold him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the floor. All of his grand pastoral authority, all of his arrogant entitlement had been entirely stripped away. He was just a pathetic thief caught in a trap of his own making. I stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, and watched as my arrogant brother and his malicious racist wife were forcefully marched out of the glass doors. Their entire empire of lies was completely destroyed, and I was the one who had methodically handed them the match. The silence that fell over the conference room after they were dragged away was profound and incredibly peaceful. The lead tech executive slowly walked back to the table, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and deep respect. He looked at the clean land deed resting safely in his hands, and then looked up at me. He softly remarked that he had never seen anyone execute a corporate trap with such absolute ruthless precision. I simply picked up my briefcase and told him that forensic accounting is a beautiful art form when practiced correctly. I walked out of City Hall knowing that the massive $36 million payout was entirely secure in my personal trust, and that my parents' toxic legacy had finally been burned to the ground. Julian and Brittany were going to spend the next several decades in a federal penitentiary, paying for the devastating sins they had so eagerly embraced. I had not just survived their constant emotional abuse and their vicious attempts to legally destroy my life. I had completely outmaneuvered them at every single turn, weaponizing their own greed against them. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the warm breeze against my skin. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely free. I was no longer the obedient, quiet daughter or the discarded scapegoat sister. I was a brilliant, wealthy, independent woman who had successfully defended her own life, and I had done it without ever raising my voice. I watched the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles disappear down the busy downtown street. Julian and Brittany were gone, hauled away in the back of separate heavily armored SUVs. The absolute disgrace of their exit was perfectly captured by the local news crews who had suddenly descended upon City Hall, alerted by the massive federal presence. I stood on the marble steps, breathing in the crisp afternoon air, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a direct message from the lead tech executive. He told me that his legal team had completely verified the clean deed. He said he had never seen anyone outmaneuver a toxic corporate entity with such flawless surgical precision. A few moments later, a second notification appeared on my screen. It was an alert from my secure offshore banking portal. The wire transfer had cleared. $36 million in pure liquid cash had just been deposited directly into my personal private trust. I looked at the string of zeros on my screen, feeling the absolute magnitude of what I had just accomplished. I had not just survived my family's relentless psychological warfare. I had dismantled their entire criminal empire and walked away with the very prize they had tried to destroy me over. But my forensic audit had revealed a wound much deeper than just my own personal trauma. The $40 million my parents had systematically stolen was not faceless corporate money. It was the collective life savings of thousands of hard-working elderly Black congregants. These were people who had scrubbed floors, driven buses, and worked double shifts just to put $10 in the offering plate every Sunday. They had trusted Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne with their spiritual salvation and their financial security. And my family had utterly betrayed them. That Sunday morning, the atmosphere inside the massive sanctuary of the megachurch was thick with absolute panic and suffocating despair. The news of Julian's federal arrest and the freezing of Breyer Holdings had completely dominated the weekend news cycle. The local papers had published the unsealed federal indictments detailing the massive decades-long pension fraud. Thousands of congregants sat in the wooden pews, weeping openly, holding their faces in their hands. The church elders, a group of older men who had blindly followed my father's charismatic leadership for years, were frantically pacing the raised altar. They were holding emergency microphones, trying desperately to calm a congregation that had just realized their entire retirement safety net had been completely vaporized. The head elder, a man whose own pension had been wiped out, was gripping the podium with trembling hands, apologizing profusely, and admitting that the church was entirely bankrupt. The wailing in the sanctuary was heart-wrenching. It was the sound of a community whose absolute faith had been weaponized against them. I pushed open the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary. The loud creak of the hinges drew the attention of the people sitting in the back rows. I was not wearing my wrinkled hospital scrubs today. I wore a perfectly tailored emerald green power suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp professional style. I carried my heavy leather briefcase, the very same briefcase that held the forensic evidence of their salvation. I began walking slowly down the long center aisle. As I moved toward the front, the weeping and the frantic shouting gradually began to die down. Whispers rippled through the massive crowd. People recognized me as the bishop's discarded daughter, the quiet accountant who had always been relegated to the background. The elders on the stage looked down at me with a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. For my entire life, I had been explicitly told that I did not belong on that raised altar. My father and Julian had constantly reminded me that the pulpit was a sacred space reserved exclusively for the male leaders of the family. They had used scripture to enforce my subservience, telling me that a woman's place was in the shadows, supporting the grand divine vision of the men. I did not stop at the base of the stairs. I kept walking, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood of the altar. I bypassed the panicked elders and stepped directly behind the main lucite podium. I looked out over the sea of devastated faces. I saw the elderly women who had baked me cookies when I was a child. I saw the retired transit workers who had helped build this very building with their own bare hands. I leaned into the microphone, and my voice echoed clearly and powerfully through the massive speaker system. I told them the absolute truth. I told them that my parents and my brother had been lying to them for 15 years. I explained exactly how the Breyer Holdings shell company had been used to systematically drain their hard-earned pension funds to pay for designer clothes, luxury cars, and private offshore estates. A collective gasp echoed through the sanctuary, followed by angry sobs. But I raised my hand, calling for absolute silence. I told them that while Julian had inherited our parents' insatiable greed, I had inherited an entirely different set of skills. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a single certified bank document. I told the congregation that 48 hours ago, I had legally seized control of the physical land that Breyer Holdings had purchased with their stolen money. I explained that I had successfully sold that land to a Silicon Valley technology firm for $36 million. I then reached into my own highly successful forensic accounting firm's private capital reserves to completely cover the remaining difference. I held the certified bank check high in the air. I announced that I was depositing exactly $40 million back into the church's independent pension trust, effectively immediately. I told them that every single dime of their retirement savings was completely restored out of my own pocket. For 3 full seconds, the entire megachurch was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. The magnitude of my words was slowly filtering through their shock. And then the sanctuary absolutely erupted. It was not a polite golf clap. It was a deafening, earth-shattering explosion of joy and overwhelming relief. Thousands of people jumped to their feet, cheering and weeping simultaneously. The church elders dropped to their knees on the altar, crying and thanking God. Elderly women in the front row were raising their hands to the ceiling, shouting my name and praising the very woman my family had tried to erase. I stood behind the pulpit, looking out at the beautiful, chaotic celebration. I had not just cleared my own name. I had become the absolute savior of the very community my parents and my brother had maliciously tried to destroy. I had taken the ultimate seat of power in my family's empire, and I had used it to deliver perfect restorative justice. Even after fully restoring the $40 million pension fund, my own personal wealth from my forensic firm, and the land sale left me with over $15 million in pure liquid assets. I was entirely financially free, untethered from the toxic legacy of my bloodline. But there was still one final thread that needed to be permanently severed. The following Tuesday, I drove my sleek new car to the county correctional facility. The concrete building was bleak and surrounded by razor wire, a stark contrast to the luxurious mega mansions Julian was accustomed to. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and was escorted to the high-security visitor visitation room. I sat in a hard plastic chair waiting behind a thick panel of reinforced bulletproof glass. A heavy metal door slammed open on the other side of the glass. Julian was escorted into the room by two large armed guards. He was wearing a bright orange county jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He looked like he had aged 20 years in a matter of days. The expensive bespoke haircuts and the arrogant posture were completely gone. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and darting nervously around the room. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me and picked up the plastic telephone receiver. I picked up my receiver and looked at him through the thick glass. He did not speak right away. He just stared at me, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Finally, he choked out a question asking me why I was there. His voice was raspy and completely defeated. He asked if I had come to gloat to laugh at him while he faced 75 years in federal prison. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any anger or malice. I told Julian that I did not come to gloat because he was no longer worth the emotional energy. I came to give him the final accounting of his legacy. I told him about Sunday morning. I told him how I had walked up to his precious pulpit and handed the congregation a certified check for $40 million, restoring every single penny of the pension fund he and our parents had stolen. I watched his eyes widen in absolute shock as the realization hit him. He asked me how I could possibly afford to do that. I smiled a genuine, peaceful smile. I told him that while he was busy posing for cameras and spending stolen money, I was building a highly lucrative forensic accounting empire in the shadows. I told him that I still had over $15 million to my name and that my firm was thriving. I told Julian that the church elders had officially stripped him of all his pastoral titles and erased his name from the building. Brittany had already filed the divorce papers and was currently cooperating with federal prosecutors to secure a lighter sentence for her own fraud charges by testifying completely against him. I told him that he had absolutely nothing left. No money, no wife, no congregation, and no legacy. He placed his hand against the bulletproof glass, a pathetic gesture of a broken man begging for a lifeline that no longer existed. He whispered my name, pleading with me to hire him a good lawyer, asking me to help him because we were family. I looked at his hand against the glass and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no obligation, and no pity. I placed the phone receiver back onto the cradle, severing his voice completely. I stood up, smoothed my elegant suit, and turned my back on him. I walked out of the prison knowing I would never have to see him again, leaving him to rot in the very hell he had built for himself. 6 months passed since that day in the visitation room. The dust had completely settled. Brittany was now working a minimum wage retail job in a dusty strip mall, her face universally despised across the internet, and her social media accounts permanently banned for massive fraudulent activity. Julian was officially serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my stunning $5 million penthouse, overlooking the vibrant Atlanta skyline. The evening air was warm, and I held a glass of incredibly expensive vintage wine. Attorney Vaughn stood right next to me. He looked much more relaxed than he did on that rainy Tuesday morning in his office so many months ago. He reached into his leather briefcase and handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was the final legally cleared title deed to our parents' historic Buckhead estate. The bank had fully foreclosed on Julian exactly as I had predicted, and I had quietly purchased the entire property back from them at a massive cash discount. Attorney Vaughn took the slow sip of his own wine and looked out at the glowing city lights. "What are you going to do with the old house, Harper?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet, genuine respect. I took a sip of my wine, looking down at the deed in my hands. I smiled. "I am bulldozing Julian's custom sneaker closet," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "We are gutting the entire mansion and turning it into a dedicated financial literacy center for young Black women. The trash has finally been taken out, Vaughn. It is time to build something beautiful." The ultimate lesson from Harper's journey is that true power never belongs to the loudest or most arrogant people in the room. Julian and Brittany built an empire on greed, deception, and exploitation, entirely blinded by their vanity. They underestimated Harper, viewing her only as a submissive cleanup crew for their garbage. But silent competence, integrity, and resilience will always outlast manufactured illusions. When you underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has endured your injustice, you are simply mapping out your own downfall. If you want to witness more powerful stories of sweet revenge and ultimate justice, hit that like button and subscribe right now.